Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome back to the Modding of Isaac with Lyte. And today we're going to cover familiars, particularly the kind that follow in a train behind you. If you're looking for something like Peeper's Eye or Bumbo, that's not going to be covered in this episode or the next one. And if you're looking for an orbital, I'd recommend you look at the code for the Marshmallow mod. It's really quite awesome and fairly straightforward. There are a few things that are a little inelegant, but all in all, a really solid mod. We're covering the ones that follow behind you because I haven't really seen any of those in the workshop, and hopefully once I fine-tune the one we're working on today, I'll upload that and you'll be able to scour the code at your leisure. So let's get started so you can actually see what we're going to be talking about. And the episode today is going to be focusing on just bringing it into existence and making it follow you around properly. Next time or the time after that, we'll cover how to make it do what you want it to do. So for example, we pick up our little Azazel. He's so cute, isn't he? And fire! Yeah, he fires a tiny little brimstone shot. Boom! Follows you around as per usual, and if we grab a little brimstone, it follows right along behind him. And we grab a new one, and that follows behind him. That's right, I finally figured out how to have multiple copies of the same thing do what they're supposed to. Took me long enough. We'll cover that as well. And so we've got a nice train of guys. All of them charge appropriately and fire appropriately. Now, it might be a little bit before I upload this to the workshop because there's still a few things that have me a little concerned. For one, when we fire, if you look right underneath of them, there's like a one-frame flash of red. I don't like it, and I don't know why it's there. Gonna try to get rid of that. The other thing is they fire your brimstone, like they're firing as you, which is not how Little Brim acts. So I need to test it out a bit and see if that's a reasonable thing for him to do and whether or not it spawns guppy flies. But that's enough showcase. Let's get to the code. So as per usual, when making an item, what we're interested in is items.xml, which is found in your content folder, because you're making something completely new. And you open it on up, and as per usual, you've got items, close the items, and then instead of active or passive after the right face and gator, it's a familiar, because of course it is. You always reference these new items by their name, so make sure you use the name. I had a little bit of an issue adding an apostrophe to Little Azazel. I'll look into that as well, so keep an eye out for that. So name Little Azazel, description adorably evil, and then GFX is just the ping of what you pick up. It's exactly the same as for a passive item or for an active item. So you're like, Lyte, if it's exactly like those other things, why is it so hard to make one? Well, this is the easy part. The hard part is actually spawning them into existence and making them do what you want them to do. This is just making the item that you pick up. This is for the collectible. The fun part is with the entity. So in that content folder, you saw there's entities too. Well, we've got that right here. So for reference, you can go into the resources folder and check out their nm2 files, and you can go into entities2.xml from there and get all of these details. Because it's not really worth it to start from scratch when they give you so many guidelines on what to do in the XML and in an nm2 file. So you find something most similar to what you want to make and just modify it a little here and there. So I just took all of the content from Little Brimstone and made it Little Azazel. As always, we need the name to be appropriate. The nm2 root, you need to make sure that is pointing to the right place in your resources folder for your nm2 file. So you're not going to find the nm2 in content anywhere. It's over here in resources under GFX. That's where I put it. 003 is saying that it's a familiar, and then I used CO1 because it's custom number 1 Little Azazel. You can name it however you like. You just need to make sure it matches here in the XML. I don't know all of the details of all of these attributes. Like, I don't know what happens when you increase the collision mass, collision radius. The friction is how fast they move. I know that much. HP boss and champion, that's mostly when you're spawning custom enemy type entities. So with little Azazel, it doesn't matter too much. Shadow size, there's a little shadow that shows up underneath of it. So if you want to make it look like he's on the ground, you just get rid of the shadow or make it much closer to him. And there are all sorts of interesting things you can do with that. Gibbs, again, it's what Gibbs, Jibs, you can pronounce it however you like, depends on the etymology you're thinking of. Again, he's not going to die, so it doesn't leave him. Then it has preloads for the various things that you might need when using this thing. Little Brim has these three because you've got the blood laser sound, you've got the laser itself, and you've got the effect of it hitting the wall. We don't use that in the technique I use for this guy, but it's good to have them there in case we do switch it over to, I don't know if canonic method's the right way to say it, but if we switch it over to being like Little Brim, just smaller, we're going to need these. So we leave them in there for now. Those are the only two XML files you need. They go into content. All of your resources, pings, NM2s, and whatnot go into resources. So characters, costumes, here we've got little Azazel. Let's zoom on in. And it's got all of the frames for his various animations. Because, well, his bobbing up and down is just a shift in the anim2 file. You don't actually need a different frame. And then you need his charging animation. That's all you need. You modify the sprite sheet, you're good to go. And then in items, collectibles, we've got little Azazel.ping. That's the one that shows up on the pedestal. So before we get over into the Lua, we're going to check out the animation editor. Because in here is where some of the magic happens for making him float and charge and shoot and whatnot. When making a very simple familiar, you're not going to need all of the animations from Little Brim. Little Brim has a lot of things that he can do. A lot of others might just have a simple shoot, and if it's the relic, all it does is bob up and down. So you might only have these float ones, and the relic doesn't even change direction when you move, so it'll just have a single float animation, and it'll just bob up and down, like you can see him doing here. So you'll notice that float down is darker than the others. You can set the default animation. So for example, if you've got the relic, there's only one animation, you set that as the default. You don't even have to tell it what to do in the Lua. When you spawn it, that's just what it's going to do. It's going to sit there bobbing up and down. It's really quite nice. Eventually, I'll go into more detail in the animation editor as to how you do the things you do. Like, as you can see, it's got different scaling going on through the different frames. And that's what makes him bob without having a different sprite. It's a little ingenious. But that's all you really need to know about this, is that it has these animations in here, and the one that you set to the default is the one that will show up when you spawn your creature. Okay? So we've covered the XMLs, we've covered the anim2s, let's get to the Lua, because this is where the fun actually happens. As always, we've got mod and game up at the top. I've done something a little different this time. It turns out you can actually modify the enumerations that come with the API. So you can add your collectible to collectible type, and you can add your familiar variant to familiar variant. So you can treat your familiar just like you would a vanilla item. You don't have to create your own little boxes to put it in. So getting the collectible is just get item ID by name, as you've always done, passive, active, anything. But then when you want to find out what little Azazel is as a familiar, you get the entity variant by name. Because we're going to summon a familiar. And then we tell it the variant of familiar. which is ours. And we look that up in the XML by name. So what we summon will always be of entity type familiar. It's just our particular variant of it. Okay? And so I've made a little helper function that will do that for us. So I made a local function. So if you followed along the function primer episode, you'll follow what this does and maybe even a little bit of why. So we have a local function spawn follower, which we hand a type and a player. And it does the whole Isaac.spawn entity type familiar, and then uses type, which is the variant. The subtype doesn't exist. You've got player.position, so we summon him where we are. Vector 00 for the velocity goes nowhere. This right here is a remnant of previous work. It doesn't matter. And then I cast it to familiar because this spawns just a plain old entity. We might want to work with it later, and it needs to be a familiar for that. So this last bit really doesn't matter at all. It doesn't do anyone any good. I put player there. You could put nil. In the end, doesn't change a thing. So that's a helper function, such that anytime we want to spawn a follower, all we need to put in is the variant and the player, and it does all the rest. So we just type this once, and every time we need to do it, we don't have to worry about spelling. Right here, we've got a realign familiars function, which we will come back to. It's crucial that we run it, but you won't understand how it works until a little bit later. We've got on update, which runs every frame. We've got get frame count equals 1. So this is just start of run code. This is me putting a couple of pedestals down. This part's not important. Here, we've got get little Azazel. So this is what happens when you get little Azazel. Whenever it spawns for the first time, it runs the MC familiar init callback. So we add the callback, familiar init, we run this function, and we only run it for little Azazel. So we've got our familiar variant dot little Azazel that we set up top. And then it gets into this function, but for little Azazel, there's no initial setup. You don't have to tell it anything when it first comes into existence, because all it needs to do is exist. If you're doing an orbital like the marshmallow, then you need to set some initial things. You need to tell it where to be, how fast to spin, all sorts of things. That's what happens here. I'm showing you just because you might need to do this, and that's how. For this episode, it's not important. Then you've got the callback for updating the familiar. We'll come back to that because it doesn't exist yet. Here is where the magic happens. In the familiars cache. Because anytime you pick up a familiars item, it triggers the familiars cache. And it doesn't matter if it's a modded familiar or a vanilla familiar, you will end up in this cache call. So you know whenever they pick up any familiar, not just one of yours, not just a modded one, any familiar gets picked up will end up in this code. So you do mod add callback, MC evaluate cache, mod on cache. We've done this for anything that you've done with stats. Well, now we're going to do it for familiars. So if the cache flag equals cache familiars, then do some things. Here's our things. What do we do? First, we have to find out how many little Azazels we already have. So how many are already in existence? So you loop through the room entities as we've done before. So 4, we've got a little blank thing. It's a placeholder for the index. We don't care about the index, comma, entity. So we grab an entity that's in the pairs of room entities. So we grab each entity and throw it in this variable and go through this loop over and over for each one of them. Then we ask, is that entity's type a familiar? So entity.type double equals entity type.entity familiar. And is its variant familiar variant dot little Azazel? So is the thing we're looking for? And if it is, we increase the count by 1, because one of them already exists. So why are we doing that? Well, you can have more than one little Azazel pickup, like somehow you got several of them. Might work with the box of friends at some point. Doesn't work right now, but it could theoretically work with box of friends or anything else that gives you an additional copy of little Azazel, because there could be some other crazy thing that gives you more than one. So we're going to introduce the while loop. This loops while this comparison is still true. So while the number of collectibles that are little Azazel is greater than how many Azazels you already have, do this stuff. And then the end always clears it off. So we look at how many little Azazels are in our inventory, how many exist on the ground, and if there's more in our inventory than are on the ground, we make one. Using our spawn follower helper function, we send it little Azazel and ourselves, and it makes one, poofs it right into being on top of us. It realigns the familiars, that function that was up there that I skipped, and then it increases the count by 1. And then tries it again. Is our inventory still bigger than how many are on the ground? No. Okay, move right along. And then realigning familiars here is in case they summoned something that wasn't little Azazel. So if we picked up little Brim, if we picked up Demon Baby, it would skip right through this code and never realign the familiars. We need to do it at least once. And doing it an extra time doesn't hurt. Little tiny efficiency hurt, but nothing you're going to notice. And it's really important to make sure that everybody lines up correctly in a row. Because just doing this, just spawning them in, will make them follow you, the player, not the train. So if you tried just spawning them in, they'll all stack right on top of each other, and it's just no good. You need to insist that they follow the rules. And if you make a train of your own, the vanilla ones won't respect it. So you have to force everybody to follow the same rules, and that's what the realign familiars function does. It's a void function, doesn't give anything back, and it doesn't take anything. You're just saying, look at the familiars that exist, make sure they're following the rules. So let's go find out those rules. In realign familiars, what we do, we start out with no caboose. We've got a train here, there's an end of the train. Isaac is the engine, there's something that is the caboose. Or there isn't. We'll see. So then you loop over the room entities, as we did before, underscore, comma, entity, in pairs of room entities, do stuff. So we check if the entity we're looking at has type familiar, and its child is nil. What we have is a parent-child relationship in the train, where the familiars closer to Isaac are the parents of the ones that are further away, and the ones further away are children of the ones that are closer to Isaac. This is, in the computing parlance, known as a doubly linked list, because it lets you go up and down from where you are to the next one in line, in either direction, hence it being doubly linked. So if the child is nil, that means it has no children. That means it's at the end of the line. Then you do another check. If the caboose is nil, which it would start as, then the caboose is that entity, because it's at the end of the line, because it has no children. Else. So let's say we found a caboose already. So we went through, we found a caboose. Going through the list, we found a caboose, going through the list, we found another one that doesn't have a child. This happens when you pick up a new familiar, whether vanilla or otherwise, it's almost definitely going to have no child. And it might not have set up the parenthood relationship properly. It might have gone to a vanilla one, might have gone to yours. It's just a mess. But we're going to fix that mess, because if we have a caboose already, now we decide which of them is the true caboose. You follow? Because we'll have our current train, and it will be added somewhere and think it's the end of the line. So we have two ends of the line. We determine who's the real end of the line. Well, it's the one that's older that gets to keep its position. The one that's younger is the new end of the line. You follow? If it's newer, it should go at the end of the line. So we check if caboose frame count is less than entity frame count. So the first one we found versus the next one we found, because there's only ever going to be two, because you gain one familiar at a time. No matter how many familiars you gain, it's still going to happen one at a time. Probably. I make no guarantees. I need to test this code more rigorously. We might need to account for multiple ends of the line, but that could be solved by multiple runs of this. So if the caboose has seen fewer frames, it is the true caboose. So you set the caboose's parent to be the entity. So the second one you found, which is older, is the parent of the younger one. You see how that works? The parent is older than the child. Brilliant! And then you set the entity's child to be the caboose. So you're setting up the list in both directions. You're saying who's the parent and who's the child on each of them. If it's not true, you do the other. You say, okay, well then clearly this one is older, so that one's the child. So caboose is older, entity's the child, entity's parent is caboose. We're looking at two ends of the line. The younger one goes at the end. And that helps keep them in the correct line, because it's that parent-child relationship that makes it all work. But you're going, Lyte, why does the parent-child thing even do anything? Well, that's what happens in the update function. When you move around, the familiar gets update called. So we have this add callback familiar update, and we send the function, and then we set the variant such that it's only called for little Azazel. So every time it gets updated, every time it needs to move or think about anything, it gets updated. And then right here at the end, and it gets sent the familiar itself. So you get the entity so you can do things to it. I called it Azazel because I like saying Azazel. So Azazel, follow parent, makes it follow whoever got set as the parent up here in realign familiars. And it follows that parent. So if you set Little Brim to be the parent of Little Azazel, he'll follow Little Brim around instead of you. Now, if a familiar's parent is nil, it follows Isaac. That's why you have that behavior when you just spawn them in, they all crowd around you. But if you set their parents differently, then... my laptop woke up. So if you set the parents, they follow the parents along. We'll have a little other parent thing when we work with how it all manifests as Little Azazel, but for now, getting them to follow along in the train is a matter of setting parents and children and then having them follow the parent. And that's really all you need, because all of this here is for making him charge and fire. If you just want it to follow like the relic, all you need in update relic is your entity, follow parent, and this function up here, realign familiars, which I'm going to show quite a bit, such that when you're trying to recreate this yourself, you've got it right there and you can see it. It'll be easier to find when scrubbing along the video. But that's really all you need for making a well-behaved familiar. You create it in the cache. If you are allowed to have, and there it goes, turned itself off. So if you've got the ability to have more than one, you need to have this while loop, and you need to do this counting of how many already exist. If you can only have one, you probably should still do this anyway. This is good code for making sure that you only spawn one if you don't have one already. They will follow you across rooms. I didn't show that in the opening, but it does keep with you across rooms. It does interact well with Box of Friends, even though it doesn't create a new one. I'm going to look into that. So that's, you spawn it in Evaluate Cache, you move it in Familiar Update, you initialize it in Familiar Init. I only use the P effect for opening the run. Realign familiars is where the real magic happens. This makes sure they stay in the train appropriately. And then spawn follower is just a little helper function. You don't strictly need it. I just like not having to type this in case I had any other place that I needed to spawn a follower. Like if I add more than just little Azazel. And as always, check your spelling and capitalization. They are the biggest pitfalls in this entire process, because any tiny little thing that isn't spelled right can spell doom for your entire mod. So let's head back over into the game. We've got our horror little guys here. Let's go to the next room just to show you that they do indeed follow through. And they do, in fact, deal damage. Let's hold R. Grab just our little Azazels. Let's deal a little damage. To Gluttony! And it almost completely destroys him, because they are pretty darn strong. Well, that's all I've got for this episode. I will see you in the next episode of the Modding of Isaac with Lyte.